Chinese President Xi Jinping stresses the need for transformation in global economic governance while meeting virtually with leaders at G20 summit, which wrapped up in Rome this weekend. And in a sideline meeting at the G20 summit with U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken, Chinese State Councilor and Foreign Minister Wang warns that the Taiwan issue, if handled wrongly, could cause subversive and overall damage to China-U.S. ties. How to understand these statements? Welcome to The Point, an opinion show coming to you live from Beijing. I'm Li Xin. The 16th G20 Leaders Summit wrapped up in Rome this weekend with the pandemic and climate change high on the agenda. Chinese President Xi Jinping, Russian President Vladimir Putin did not attend physically but spoke virtually. Earlier, the U.S. said the other G20 members can be energized and united without the presence of Chinese leaders. During the summit, Chinese State Councilor and Foreign Minister Wang had an hour-long talk with his U.S. counterpart on the sidelines on Sunday. To help put all of these into perspective, I'm pleased to be joined from San Francisco by Professor Kishore Mahbubani, Distinguished Fellow of the Asia Research Institute and also founding Dean of the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy from National University of Singapore, and from Beijing by Professor Jia Qingguo, former Dean of the School of International Studies at Peking University. Gentlemen, welcome to The Point. So at the very beginning of his speech, President Xi Jinping said the Rome summit demonstrates the mission of the G20 to lead the transformation of global economic governance. He said major economies should adopt responsible macroeconomic policies, prevent measures taken for themselves from entailing rising inflation, exchange rate fluctuations, or mounting debts, avoid negative spillovers on developing countries, and ensure sound operation of the international economic and financial system. At the same time, we should also take a long-term perspective, improve the global economic governance system and values, and make up for the relevant governance deficit. Kishore, let me go to you first. Why did he put so much emphasis on governance? What exactly is the governance deficit he's referring to?
Well, I must say it's very wise for President Xi to focus on the governance deficit because, but the trouble is that the governance deficit is a very abstract term and nobody knows what it means. But let me explain it in simple terms, which I hope everybody can understand. So in the past, when 7.8 billion people were living in 193 separate countries, the separate countries were like separate boats, and each boat had a captain, a governance for each boat. But now the world has shrunk dramatically. We live in a small, interdependent world. And so the 193 countries have become 193 cabins on the same boat. So all of us are on the same boat today. That's what the world is like today. And if you are on the same boat, if you're just taking care of your cabin and not taking care of the boat, you're in trouble because when the boat sinks, the cabin sinks. So the big message I think which President Xi is trying to convey is that if we are all cabins on the same boat, we must also take care of the boat as a whole. And we must look at global challenges and respond to them globally. And the problem is that the West, unfortunately, which created this whole concept of sovereignty, is just focused on their own national interests while forgetting they're on the same boat as the rest of the world. So I think it's very wise for President Xi to say, hey, let's come together and try to fix the problems of the world together. And that's what the governance deficit I think is all about.
Professor Jia, is China speaking for itself or for other developing countries in general, which are a minority indeed in this organization that's called G20? What kind of governance is China calling for?
Well, I think China is speaking both for itself and for other developed countries. For their own reasons, some developed countries are adopting a loose fiscal policy pumping trillions of dollars into their economies, despite their mounting government debts. This threatens serious global inflation. This poses a serious challenge to both China and other developing countries. So it is natural that China is concerned about it and raised this issue at the G20 summit. Mm-hmm. What China wants is not to condemn anyone, but a sound fiscal policy that addresses not just the domestic needs of certain countries, but also takes care of the interests of the developing countries.
One part of his speech which caught my attention, Kishore, is when President Xi pledged to stay committed to institutional opening up that covers rules, regulations, management and standards, and step up the protection of IP rights. What do you make of his pledge?
Well, I think it's a very positive pledge because, you know, if I can go back to my boat analogy, and I'm sorry to do so, if we are all together in one small planet, trying to work out ways and means of how to save our common planet, the best way to do so is to create common rules that apply to everybody equally. And to create a common set of rules is actually in the interests of every human being on planet Earth. Because then you realize that you have a common set of rules. And I'm actually very glad that he mentioned IP. Because, you know, the story of intellectual property is a very complicated one, okay? I mean, today the United States is the biggest custodian of intellectual property. But in the 19th century, the United States was the biggest thief of intellectual property. When the British were number one, the Americans were stealing from the British. But today, when more and more countries, including China, are producing a lot of intellectual property, it's in China's interest, America's interest, Europe's interest, and the rest of the world's interest to protect rules of intellectual property. But the critical thing is this: you must create rules that apply to everybody equally. And if President Xi, as he said in his statement, is pushing for these common rules, the West should say, yes, we agree with you, and we want these common rules.
Professor Jia, President Xi, looking in his speech from a comprehensive perspective, altogether stressed 5 things: COVID-19, global economic recovery, inclusiveness for common development, innovation, and harmonious coexistence for sustainable development. Help us understand his logic, please.
I think these are the things that China cares most about, and China believes that the world should care about these things and try to work together to deal with these things. The COVID-19 pandemic has caused great damage, and because of the lack of cooperation and coordination between the developed countries and the big countries, we have suffered more than we should. So it's time for us to work more closely together to deal with this. Global economy recovery, inclusiveness for common development, innovation, harmonious coexistence for sustainable development. All these things, you know, are in. If we can work together, we can do much better than otherwise.
Unfortunately, the attention by some seem not to be on what he says, but where he was when he said it. Kishore, some political commentators have said that his physical absence from the G20 summit shows that China no longer feels the need to cooperate whatsoever, and that China has shifted its strategy more inward and is less focused on foreign policy. Do you find any merit in such opinions?
Well, I mean, you know, the important thing you should judge countries by is by their actions and not whether or not they necessarily turn up at meetings. And here I completely agree with what Professor Jia Qingguo said, that COVID-19 clearly is a common challenge that we all face. And by the way, in COVID-19 incidentally confirms the validity of my boat analogy when I say the 193 countries are no longer in separate boats. Because if they were in separate boats, if COVID-19 hit one boat, it wouldn't affect the other boat. We are in separate boats. But the fact that we are all now 193 cabins on the same boat is proven by the fact that COVID-19 affected one cabin and then all 193 cabins got it. So at the end of the day, the critical thing we should monitor is not whether countries come for the meetings or not come for the meetings, but whether or not they contribute to finding a global solution. And here, just to build on a critical point that Professor Jia Qingguo made, you know, the IMF has come up with a study which shows that if the world could spend $50 billion to vaccinate every person in the world, we would kill COVID-19. And frankly, that's what the G20 meeting in Rome should have agreed to. Because $50 billion is not a lot of money. Because China alone contributed $50 billion to saving the world in the 2008-2009 financial crisis. When the G20 meeting met in London, that was the most successful G20 meeting ever. And that meeting in London agreed to a $1 trillion stimulus to save the world, and it did. But the meeting in Rome should have agreed on $50 billion to vaccinate everybody in the world, and it failed to do so. So it's not about who attends the meeting or who doesn't attend the meeting. At the end of the day, it's about results, and it's a pity that the G20 meeting in Rome failed to agree to spend $50 billion to vaccinate the world, because that would have made the world a much safer place.
Professor,
and that's the tragedy of the Rome meeting.
Professor Jia, what is your assessment of the outcome of the meeting and the reasons behind it? Is it a lack of will, a lack of resources, or that they have been misled by the media's focus on who is where instead of what is being done?
Yeah, I agree with Professor Mahbubani that this meeting is short of expectations. I think we should devote more resources and work more closely together to fight the pandemic and also to deal with other issues at hand more closely. The problem is I think some countries attach too much importance to ideology and some kind of a small group approachment to world problems. I think it's time to be more inclusive. The reason that I don't know the reason why we have this kind of arrangement. President Xi, President Putin, and others did not show up at the G20. I think it has a lot to do with the pandemic. It also has a lot to do with their domestic politics, but it also has a lot to do with the current atmosphere of international politics. I think some countries are trying to forge close alliances, exclusive alliances to exclude others. I think this is not a good approach to global governance.
And then they're criticizing the leaders, which they're trying to exclude from not showing up. Anyway, we're going to take a very short break. Professor Mahbubani and Professor Jia will stay with us, and we'll have one more guest joining us to talk about U.S.-China's relations, especially concerning the issue of Taiwan. Stay with us. China's State Councilor and Foreign Minister Wang and U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken met on the sidelines of the G20 on Sunday. Blinken said the U.S. has not changed its one China principle, but needs to make sure that Taiwan has the means to defend itself Wang Yi said it was misleading to blame China for changing the status quo across the Taiwan Strait and warned that if the issue is handled wrongly, it could cause subversive and overall damage to bilateral ties. So what exactly do these statements mean? Is the U.S. still testing China's bottom line on the Taiwan issue? To get to the bottom of these important new developments, we still have in Beijing Professor Jia Qingguo, from former Dean of the School of International Studies at Peking University. From San Francisco, Professor Kishore Mahbubani, Distinguished Fellow at the Asia Research Institute and also founding Dean of the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy of the National University of Singapore. And from Newton, Massachusetts, Professor Stephen Goldstein, Director of the Taiwan Studies Workshop of Harvard University. Professors, welcome to all of you. Let me go to Professor Goldstein first. 2 points here on U.S.-China relations. Basically, first is about so-called defense of Taiwan. The other is involving the UN. On the first, Blinken told Wang Yi that the U.S. has not changed its One China principle, but has a long-standing commitment to make sure Taiwan has the means to defend itself. But when grilled by CNN, he also refused to say that the U.S. will defend Taiwan. Professor Goldstein, how do you interpret these messages?
I can't resist beginning by saying how satisfied I am that I'm on this show with Jia Qingguo. We've been colleagues working in the field of U.S.-China relations for the past 40 years, and I have many fond memories of our interactions. How do I interpret what Secretary of State Blinken said? You've got to go, rather than depending on what the Secretary of State said, I think you have to rely on the Taiwan Relations Act. And the Taiwan Relations Act is not simply about providing arms to Taiwan. The Taiwan Relations Act in Section 3 also has a provision for U.S., for the President and Congress to consult should there be a threat to Taiwan. And that's more than selling arms. That's possible action. So the U.S. policy towards Taiwan does have the stipulation that there could be intervention by the United States under certain conditions. And that's where strategic ambiguity comes in.
All right, let me jump in.
Strategic ambiguity.
Yeah.
Okay, go.
Let me jump in here. Professor Jia, what do you make of the fact that Professor Goldstein cited the Taiwan's Relations Act? What is the cornerstone of U.S.-China relations?
Yeah, well, I agree with Professor Goldstein that the Taiwan Relations Act has some rooms for maneuver on the part of the U.S. government. However, in addition to the Taiwan Relations Act, we have the 3 communiques, which establishes the fact that there is only one China. The PRC government is the sole legitimate government representing China, and also U.S. would gradually phase out its arms sales program. But over the years, I think the U.S. observation of the 3 communiques has been eroded over time. There is a lot of changes. That's why the Chinese government becomes so upset and uneasy. That, to some extent, explains the current cross-strait relations. And of course, it's a very complicated process. What happened in Taiwan mattered a great deal. Since the election of the DPP regime, we had a problem. They backtracked on the One China 92 consensus. And then we had a negative set of interactions across the Taiwan Strait. That caused a lot of frustration on the part of the U.S. government to some extent, and that again trumped some of their activities, which in Chinese eyes are very offensive. So we are in a very difficult situation across the Taiwan Strait.
Talking about the very latest development, Tsai Ing-wen, the leader of DPP, confirmed last week, or the leader of Taiwan confirmed last week for the first time the presence of American troops on Taiwanese soil, and said we have, meaning the US and Taiwan, have a wide range of cooperation aimed at increasing our defense capability. Kishore, how serious is this to bilateral ties between China and the United States that the US is stationing military personnel, albeit small, in Taiwan?
Well, I mean, I would agree with both Steve Goldstein and Jia Qingguo that the Taiwan issue is probably the most important and difficult issue in US-China relations, because the fundamental question that US and China have to ask themselves is, do you really want to fight a nuclear war over Taiwan? And let's be very clear about one thing. In a nuclear war, there are no winners. There's a loser and there's a loser. 15 cities in the United States, 30 cities in China. You're talking about a very serious consequences. So let's be very serious when we are talking about Taiwan. And here I want to emphasize, and I agree with Professor Steve Goldstein, that the Taiwan Relations Act is important. But it was passed 40 years ago in a different environment. As recently as 1995, 1996, President Clinton could send 2 aircraft carriers into Taiwan Straits and say, hey, I'm the big guy around here. But if you look at the recent issue on national interest, Professor Graham Allison, a Harvard professor, has written to say that the military balance across the Taiwan Straits has changed dramatically. Today, the United States cannot send 2 aircraft carriers into the Taiwan Straits because they're very vulnerable in the new military environment. So going to what Tsai Ing-wen said, I think it's important for someone to talk to Tsai Ing-wen and tell her that at the end of the day, her responsibility is to protect the lives of 25 million Taiwanese. And the best way to protect the lives of 25 million Taiwanese is to not provoke a war over Taiwan, because if there's a war over Taiwan, nobody wins, everybody loses.
Professor Goldstein, you would like to react to all of this that has been said?
Well, you can make all kinds of dire statements about what can happen in the Taiwan Strait. The point is that the status quo today, as it's been since 1979, is a status quo of mutual frustration. Neither China nor Taiwan can get what they want. The United States wants to maintain working relationships with both and avoid any kind of intervention in a conflict between China and Taiwan. The point is that it's manageable. We have been able to manage it since 1979. It was managed during the administration of Chen Shui-bian. That's more important, to keep in mind that this is a manageable difference and not a difference that must lead to war. So rhetoric about the danger of war and atomic warfare gets us nowhere. What gets us somewhere is to consider what it would take for all 3 sides, because today all 3 sides are pushing the envelope. All 3 sides are approaching dangerous points.
Okay, time is very limited. Let me jump in here. Yeah, we have only 2 minutes left. I'm going to give 1 minute to Professor Jia to react to this, and 1 minute to Kishore, please. Maximum. Professor Jia, you first.
Yeah, I think definitely we need to manage this issue. It's unfortunate that the Taiwan issue has become a matter of identities, identity conflicts. In the U.S., it becomes an issue of democracy or values. In Taiwan, became a sort of ethnic separatism. In the mainland, it's an issue of national identity. So when it becomes an identity issue, you become emotional and less calculating, less rational. So we have to return this issue and become more pragmatic in our efforts to manage it.
Okay, Kishore, 1 minute, please.
I agree with Professor Steve Goldstein that this is manageable. But as I document in my book, Has China Won? One reason why it was manageable is that the reason why the Bush administration came down very hard on Chen Shui-bian is because the Bush administration needed the help of China on Iraq. And there was a trade-off that was done down there. So it's important for us to review the entire history and understand that Taiwan has been at peace because of a series of understandings, as Professor Steve Goldstein said. Let us respect those understandings and don't change them. That's how you preserve peace in Taiwan.
Thank you so much. We are going to leave it there. Many thanks to our guests. Definitely half an hour is not enough for all of these important topics and the insights that our guests are able to share. But once again, many thanks to Kishore Mahbubani, Professor Jia Qingguo, and Professor Stephen Goldstein. And with that, we come to the end of this edition of The Point with me, Li Xin. As always, you can follow me on Facebook and Twitter using the handle Li Xin in Beijing. Thanks for watching. You've got The Point.